Somebody last time asked why the people in the Middle Ages were suckers for these arguments that seem to establish the validity of any kind of belief established through logic and reason and observation, a belief in God, and why they fell for these arguments. And that got me thinking. I mean, one of this is my fault to a degree because I presented Hume as coming in and just blowing these arguments away, which he did, and I'll get back to that. It was a masterstroke and a really important one. But I think I made it sound too uh, uh, easy for Hume. It wasn't easy. I'm not talking about, well, first of all, it was not easy in terms of political courage because it just wasn't cool to be an atheist. And secondly, it was not easy in terms of how smart you had to be to make up those arguments. And a lot of the stuff that I criticized St. Thomas's proof for the existence of God, those proofs, most of the criticisms I gave you were from Hume, or at least half of them. Believe it or not, a couple of them came from Voltaire and and others. But I don't want to make it seem like it was too facile for him to do this. And so, what I want to do today, I don't usually like to do this, but I want to get a broad picture, a broader picture, and kind of go back to the very beginning. I don't like to do this too much because I can handle specific arguments with more credibility than I can a big picture. Big pictures are almost never justifiable completely. They're all just okay. Here's how you can look at this, and that's what I'm going to give you today. I'm less comfortable with that, but I'm going to do it anyway. Um, so when I say big picture, I'm going to start at the beginning of the universe. I guess that's about as big as we need to go. And here's what happened. I wrote this out simply because I don't usually write this stuff. Um, but I wrote it out because I was afraid I'd spin off into, 10 different topics, and I wanted to keep it uh, as focused as I could. So anyway, here we go. And this I remind you of the phrase ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is my idea of what we're doing here. We're trying to individually, all of us, go through the steps, intellectual steps, through the growth of uh, human beings awakening to the world we have right now. Awakening might be too uh, positive a word. I don't mean that we're all completely correct right now, and they weren't uh, uh, 4,000 years ago. But nevertheless, I think most of us would not want to abandon science. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about. By the way, some of my Latino buddies are up on the roof right now, blowing the roof off. And I have never understood people's hostility to Latinos. I just love the fact that I live in San Rafael. We got a vibrant Anyway, that's off the subject. But that's where the noise is that you're that's where the noise is coming from. Um, okay, so after 10 billion years or so of the existence of the universe, some slime started to grow on an obscure planet for mysterious reasons. And after another 4 billion years, critters like us started to actually wonder about the world. According to Aristotle, because we have the desire to understand. The incomprehensible improbability of this outcome out of the vastness of space and time far surpasses all the miracles of the Bible taken together, including the flood, the rising of the dead, and the parting of the Red Sea. Can you guys hear okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, all
Okay.
good.
Yes.
All right.
Who,
So,
who are you quoting again?
sorry,
Who are you quoting?
that's me. I'm not quoting
That's you.
anybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, With our newfound ability to talk to each other, which probably happened at least 200,000 years ago, but maybe twice that. We don't know that the Neanderthals couldn't talk. Anyway, with that newfound ability, humans made up stories or myths to explain the world, featuring characters who, though supernatural, were like ourselves. These myths were etiological. I think I discussed this word earlier. Etiological myths are myths that explain how things are the way they are. These myths were ideological and functioned to solidify group identity, justify social structures and practices, and explain the puzzling and frightening doings of the world. The mythology discussed in Hume, Campbell, Levi-Strauss, Mircea Eliade, Malinowski, and Fraser seems intrinsic to human thought, which is, of course, a main teaching of Carl Jung. After several 100,000 years, in other words, after we started speaking to each other and explaining things to one another, some people with revolutionary insight, starting with Thales, thought to ask whether those stories made sense and were consistent both internally and with observations of the world. A negation was adopted that didn't rely on the elders or scripture, but on logic and observation. After another few hundred years, this analytic methodology was used to question mythology in the specific logical questions of Plato's Euthyphro. Some Greeks, along with Socrates, for example, Anaxagoras and the Atomists, came to wonder whether myth and logic could coexist. But myth reestablished itself, never having been entirely vanquished to this day in Christianity. Substituting monotheism for polytheism, the new myths were more easily subjected to systematization and logical analysis than the chaotic polytheism of Greece and Rome. As far as is known, no human society exists or ever has existed without mythology, whereas many have existed without the sort of thought exemplified by the early Greek philosophers. The Bible contains no passages that exhibit the reasoning we see in Plato and Aristotle. For, say, 1,500 years, folks tried to reconcile this logic with the mythology, in other words, Christianity, that the entire society of literate Western humans had come to accept. It would have seemed natural, even obvious to most Christians, that of course logic would support biblical teachings. To be fair to the Christians, there were exceptions. Ganello, a monk who was a contemporary of Anselm, applied critical logic to arguments, as did Aquinas himself and Occam. But the world described by mythology, featuring creatures that have recognizable human characteristics, is very comforting compared to the terrifying and alien power that really lies out there. However, this has only been discovered in our lifetimes, really. And even now, our cleverest methods of analysis are incapable of describing it sensibly. It took 2,000 years after Thales for Hume to establish clearly, with very insightful arguments, that myth could not be reconciled with logic and observation. This was a profound upheaval, and without it, we'd have no Kant, Hegel, Marx, Schopenhauer, or the existentialists. So, for 200,000 years at minimum, and probably twice that, mythology was what humans used to understand the world. To deny it was to disrespect the traditional culture and elders, and possibly put one's life at risk. That is a tremendous amount of inertia, which in many ways still rules our world. So this is a long-winded answer to the question of why did the people in the Middle Ages buy those arguments? Okay, now one final thought that gets us a little bit ahead of ourselves and to the 20th century. Reconciliation between logic and mythology may not be necessary. We may say that when we use clear logic, we are playing what Wittgenstein calls a language game. That is not how all language works. In other words, logic works in the arena that it is designed to work in. But it can language can be metaphoric and not specifically verifiable, and yet be perfectly useful and meaningful. And I have a couple of examples here. One is I have a really devout Christian friend of mine that I met at the Yale Divinity School. And I said, you know, Tom, and actually he's a Pomona grad, Tom Drew. I don't know if any of you knew Tom Drew, kind of a weirdo, but sweet guy, very erudite, well-read guy, and but a devout Christian. And I said, Tom, you know, and there's a great Kierkegaard parable about this that we'll get to. I said, Tom, I just can't buy. There's so many weird things about the Bible and so many weird things I'm asked to believe. I just don't know. But I'll say this, I understand what it means if you were to say, thank God you're okay. I understand what you're saying. It's not nonsense. I understand what you're saying. And he said to me, well, then you know everything there is to know then. That was his answer. Here, another example of language not being specifically susceptible to logic is, suppose I say to you after a heated conversation, you can find your own way out. Well, I'm not saying something about my confidence in your ability to navigate yourself to the door. I'm saying, get the fuck out of here. I'm tired of you. That's what I'm saying. And everybody would understand that's what I'm saying. So to try to, uh, this is what Wittgenstein tried to do in his logical Tractatus Philosophicus, was to try to say that language that falls outside the grid of logically establishable sayings or justifiable empirical sayings doesn't mean anything. He realized later, Wittgenstein realized that's just not how language works, and it's not how it works 90% of the time. 90% of the time, we understand each other perfectly well without saying anything that could be verified empirically or include some kind of logically perfect statement. All right, so uh, all of the above was just to address myself to the question of why would people have believed this nonsense, these arguments that were so bad in the Middle Ages? And that's my answer to that, probably more than I needed to give you. Any questions about that before I return more specifically to David Hume? Okay.
Well,
Um,
I want to say thank you for doing that.
oh,
Yeah. And it reflects back on a good story is always better than a paragraph of you know what I mean?
yeah.
Yeah, which is why
Well,
myth is so powerful. Is it's a good story, right?
yeah, and that's what the Bible is full of myths. There are, as I mentioned in there, there's no debate like a Platonic debate any place in the Bible. It's all stories, parables. Sometimes somebody will dispute a teaching and say, no, that's not the true teaching, and say something like that. But there's no real analysis of or request for evidence or anything like that. That just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in the Quran. It doesn't happen in the Vedas. It doesn't happen in the Sutras. It doesn't happen in any religious literature that I'm familiar with, except for the theologians who will argue, Aquinas or Karl Barth or Karl Rahner or somebody like this. Those guys will engage in arguments, but that's their job. They're not trying to, they're apologists, as I've mentioned before. Uh, any other comments on that?
Is it understood? Do you think that by believers that the Bible is made up of myths, that the symbolic nature that they understand that? Or
Well,
I
I
don't
think,
know. I'm not. I don't know personally. It always seem like fairy tales to me. But
well, yeah, I know you can't, I can't, can you still hear me?
yeah,
Okay, I can't characterize what all Christians believe. There's a certainly a school of thought that every word of the Bible is the gospel truth right out of God's mouth, and it's not possible to dispute even a sentence, which is a little weird because there, as I may have mentioned, there are two and not genealogies of Jesus in the Gospels, and they don't agree with one another. So I'm not sure how I can accept one of those as being God's honest truth and the other one as also being God's honest truth, because they're inconsistent with one and incompatible with one another. I don't know how, there's a million things like that in the Bible. I may have mentioned, if you want to read a great critique of the Bible itself, Thomas Paine, the founding father, his Age of Reason is fabulous. It's just such a great book. That's Thomas Paine. Anyway, there are people, Doug, that believe that, and then there are other people who believe that, well, like Jefferson, that you could just take out the teachings of Jesus and believe that. But I don't think Jefferson would have called himself a a typical Christian. I think he made that with his eyes wide open. He made that list or that Jefferson Bible with his eyes wide open. And that was true of Paine too. I mean, they believed in some kind of deity, but they thought the stories of the Bible were unacceptable. Socrates thought that the stories of the gods in Homer were also inconsistent with something that would be actually true. Socrates was critical of that, which by extension, I think we can assume Plato was critical of that. Barry, you had your hand up?
I wanted to ask you, how do you account for the fact that so many scientists, uh, contemporary scientists who are respected for their great analytical abilities, also tend to be believers in a supernatural, uh, godlike entity?
Well,
That's true.
I'm sorry. Who was
Yeah,
going to say?
is that really true, Barry?
Well,
Well,
yeah, I think it is actually.
Well, it's true of some of them. And the thing is, Barry, I'd say the same thing with regard to them that I just said with regard to all Christian believers. There are guys like if you Einstein's concept of God was Leibniz's concept, which is more like a scientific God, something like that, um, rather than a biblical or scriptural God. It was more like a scientific entity. Uh, Doug has just brought up the name Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Catholic monk who, I'm not sure he's a monk. I think he was, though. He was definitely a Catholic theologian. And he has a, I love Teilhard, but Teilhard is somebody who developed a theory that this is like one of those things like Hobbes, where he develops a theory about how humanity works and how God works that is really not very compatible with the Bible, but it's so heartfelt and written so well and reasoned out so well. And it's a beautiful vision of how things work. Um, but he's not a scientist. So Barry was asking about a scientist, about scientists. I know the head of one of the head of the, it seems to me the Genome Project was a Christian. And anyway, I would answer that the way I answered just a few minutes ago about whether we have to have, he was a geologist, but he was a Catholic, uh, he was some kind of Catholic guy. I'm not sure he was a priest or a monk or a member of an order, but anyway, oh yeah, so he was, Doug was saying he was a geologist in response to my saying he wasn't really a scientist. Well, I don't think his geology is what he's known for. Let's put it that way. Um, anyway, Barry, getting back to your question, what you can do is say uh, that, like my sister is a Christian, all lifetime devout Christian. And I talked to her and one day, and she about this, and she's a civil person. She doesn't get all defensive about it. And she said, "Look, all I know is this is where I love to be in church, and I'm supposed to love my brother. And beyond that, you can have all the theology." I think there's a whole lot of Christian, and my sister is a computer scientist. So I think that going back to Wittgenstein, you can have your scientific, uh, well, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, as I said, has two magisteriums that this is 20th century stuff, I believe. Two magisteriums. In other words, a magisterium is a sphere of authority, and the Catholic Church defers factual investigation to science. It says we can't say that we know more about science than the scientists. Our magisterium, our sphere of authority is value, what means something, what's important, what is spiritually sustainable for you as a human being. And they separate those things. That's the Catholic Church. That's not exactly some weird cult, obscure cult or conspiracy theory. That's their official point of view right now. And I'm not sure. I think you would. Well, I don't. There's so many answers to this, and I just don't want to go down. Uh, but uh, uh, but if you believe in God, nothing is inconsistent. In other words, even if you say, well, but Darwin said that we evolved from apes, and if you believe in God, you can frame that in all kinds of ways. Well, Darwin was created by God. And so whatever Darwin said, God must have willed. Because if God is omniscient and omnipotent, then nothing could have happened that's outside of his control, including the development of science. There's all kinds of ways to answer this question. So if you're not going to get a simple one from me, though, the thousands of pages of theology have been written about questions like this. Um, yeah, Doug.
I I'm just sort of making this up right at the moment, but I'm and trying to figure. But I'm wondering if all this whole in, structure going back thousands of years is really about symbols, and the symbols represent sort of underlying human psychological needs. You know, um, I mean,
Well,
the
that
idea
was
of God is a symbol, of something that we need, fathers or God knows what, I'm just
that's
wondering.
Well, I just rattle off all those names of, Mircea Eliade and Jung and Campbell and all those guys are kind of in that camp. That there is something peculiar. I think you'd have to admit. What Jung points out is that all of these mythologies, well, him and Campbell want to say that you can find similar structures within all of them. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why is that the case with some myth from Afghanistan and Papua New Guinea and Oklahoma? Why do all those myths have the same structure or an identifiable structure? And of course, Carl Jung attributes that to the collective unconscious, that there is a kind of collective unconscious that we all share in organically, and that's what produces similar stories from different cultures. Let's
Go
see.
back to Plato. Does this go
Yep.
back to the forms?
Uh, it would be a different way of explaining certain things than the forms. The forms, however, I don't think make Darwin. Excuse me. I don't think that Jung makes the claim that these uh, archetypes, of what he calls them as archetypes of the collective unconscious. I don't think he makes the claim, as Plato would, that they actually reflect some real thing in the universe, some real structure of the universe. He's just saying that yes, we share these. And Malinowski thought that myths have pragmatic functions within a society. I mentioned some of them, that if you believe certain things, it solidifies the community and explains why things are done the way they are, or explains why one caste of people is higher than another caste of people. So it can having a structure like this can lead to a more cohesive society, a religious structure. Anyway, this is such a big question that I think I'm afraid we'll just get lost in speculation. Yeah, Barry.
Well, I mean, just saying what I'm taking out of this is, that there are different kinds of ways of thinking. Logical thinking, scientific thinking is one mode of thinking. It's not the only mode of thinking. And non-rational thinking encompasses a lot of the things that are important to us as human beings. And so the fact, it doesn't surprise me that many scientists also have a spiritual set of beliefs because they recognize the limits of science and logical thinking.
Well, that's a nice dovetail into Immanuel Kant and David Hume, but uh, yeah, I mean that's what I said very earlier about Wittgenstein, that he considers there's not one way to characterize what language is doing. And um, again, getting ahead of myself, in the 20th century, what philosophers, a lot of people have uh, really been critical of 20th century philosophy because it's not answering the big questions anymore. And why is that? Well, philosophers realized that everything that they did was expressed in language. And they said, well, maybe we ought to be careful about exactly what we mean when we're saying things, because it's like, what does this experiment mean? This is no different from what Socrates was doing. Is going, well, what do you mean by that? Socrates had a different metaphysical set of metaphysical assumptions, whereas the 20th century guys try to avoid any underpinning metaphysical assumptions. I'm going to try to revert to Hume at this point because I'm afraid these are huge questions and they occupy the entire history of philosophy. But I'm afraid that we can't solve them all in this little gathering. They're ancient questions and they're big ones. So
Damn you.
yeah, well, I think we'll accomplish more if we actually one by one consider. By the way, what you do when you study philosophy is you go through all these guys and you learn how they think. And then you take each one of them and go back through all of the previous guys and use the framework you just learned. Like, in other words, you use Hume to go back to Plato. And then you use Plato to analyze Hume. That's how you get comfortable with these guys. You don't just say he said this and he said this. Well, what if I take this guy's approach and attack Aquinas with it, or attack Augustine with it? And so that's what an education in philosophy uh, requires. And if you're really good, you also do that in 4 languages or something, like German, French, ancient Greek, and Latin and English. But I'm not that good, so I didn't I didn't do that. Um, anyway, let's return to Hume so we can get some kind of uh, framework that is a little bit limited. I want to review just some basic things that we talked about with Hume. I think I mentioned that Hume had 4 things that he doubted that they could be uh, validated. And remember, Hume has something called Hume's fork, and Hume's fork is that whatever you're saying, it must be either a matter of fact, which means traceable back to some actual experience, like a science experiment or a witnessing a visual experience of, or it has to be a relation of ideas, and relations of ideas are things like 2 + 2 = 4. So if you can't justify it by one of those 2 methods, Hume says you should throw it into the fire. Now, like I say, he's overstating the case. You can still talk and you can still think you know things about the universe. But what he's talking about specifically is the kind of metaphysical claims that Thomas Aquinas and that kind of thinker is trying to make. I think I mentioned one with Descartes that's a typical kind of scholastic claim. The lesser cannot cause the greater. And he uses that in his um, uh, proof for the existence of God. We find this is Descartes. We find that we have a picture of a perfect being in our mind. We couldn't have caused it because we're imperfect, and therefore it must have been caused by God. I already discussed why I thought that was a stupid argument, but um, the principle, the lesser cannot cause the greater. It sounds like it makes sense. However, it's just on the face of it false. I could start a forest fire with a match. It's just not true. And so the fact that it's not true, that it can't be verified, that principle can't be verified according to Hume by sense data. I can disprove it easily, like I just did. So Hume says we got to throw that out. Whereas the scholastic philosophers that he's trying to criticize believe that, oh, yes, the lesser, of course, couldn't cause the greater. So the greater must have been caused by something greater than it, even, which would be God. That's the logic of the scholastics. Now, the four things that Hume said couldn't be verified in the way that he suggests are the self. He said we have no actual experience of the self. We just have, if you try to introspect, you don't see the self. You see a bunch of memories, hopes, uh, uh, current perceptions, uh, emotions. You see all kinds of things when you try to look inside yourself, but what you don't see is the thing that's doing the perceiving. This is a point that Kant is going to make a lot of hay out of. But anyway, the origin comes from Hume himself. You don't see the thing that's doing the seeing. I compare it to like the eyeball doesn't see itself. So the thing that's doing the perceiving doesn't see itself any more than the eyeball can see itself. The eyeball can see itself in a mirror. I can see myself in somebody in the mirror too. I can see my face anyway. Can I see myself that way? Can I see the thing that's doing the perceiving in the mirror? I don't think so. So this is the point Hume's making about that. So the self is one of the things that has to be cast into the flames. And this is a really seriously interesting point, and that's Kant is going to pick up on that. The second thing is causality, and we I think already talked about this was a big thing. This is what caught this was the main thing that caught uh, um, the attention of Kant. Kant, the famous quote from Kant was that Hume awakened me from my dogmatic slumbers because he had been teaching kind of a scholastic kind of philosophy. And then he read Hume and he went, oh my God, I'm going to have to start all over again, which he did. But Hume's books, uh, his two philosophy, he was a famous historian, but his two philosophy books uh, did not have a good audience. And Hume was the first major guy to take him seriously. And it was 20 years later, it was 20 years after Hume published his big philosophy books that Kant goes, oh, this guy has screwed everything up and took him seriously. So Hume must have been kind of anyway, Hume was depressed actually that he wasn't better received. Okay, so we got the self causality. What his problem with the causality is what Hume says is you perceive event A and you perceive event B, but you never perceive the link, the chain between them. All you see is those two events. And if they happen together often enough, then you call it cause, and he calls this a habit of mind. And I think with Laurel, we discussed Mill's methods, and all of the strategy you use with inductive reasoning. In other words, to try to find what causes what. And we mentioned that causality isn't the same thing as just what's the word? Um, anyway,
Yeah,
just be what is it?
Is Hume by saying you can't verify causality? Is he rejecting the kinds of science, empirical science that we do in biology, chemistry, physics, whatever? Or is he where you can actually do experiments and verify that A causes B with an experimental process as well as serious, careful observations? Is he rejecting that?
Absolutely not. That's not what he's talking about. Remember, he's responding to the scholastic argument that that the causes can't go on to infinity. There has to have been a first cause, and that's God. That's St. Thomas Aquinas. He specifically, huh?
Magical causes. I
Yeah,
mean,
he's specifically
causes you hypothesize but can't see or verify. That that he's rejecting the scholastics kind of version.
well. I mean, the the way we use causality is perfectly acceptable. You know, like I mentioned, if I hit you in the face and you are mad at me, the reason that you're mad is because I hit you in the face. That we understand that perfectly well. By the way, I don't think I'll do that. But what he's talking about is metaphysical arguments by this whole tradition of scholastic thinkers that said that we can reason from these two events uh, to an event that we've never seen and could not see, namely God. We the there is one sense, Laurel, in which he does say we can question science, but not the way you said. He says that all science is perforce history. In other words, we can't know that something completely beyond our imagination couldn't happen 2 seconds from now. We can't know that. All we can know is based on all the science we've observed up to this moment. Beyond that, we can predict, and by the way, I think I've mentioned this too again. The law of induction, the problem of induction is that the law of induction has always worked in the past, so it will work in the future. Well, the problem with that is that it's circular. The only reason we know the problem of induction work the only reason we know induction works is that it always has worked. So you're using the logic, the internal logic of induction to justify itself, and that can't be validated. Meredith.
Um, Now, my dad, who was a scientist, used to say, change is the only constant. And I think I always understood him to mean that nothing is fixed, that you're being downloaded constantly, you as yourself, and that otherwise things in general are changing constantly. And therefore, there's not a fixed, you can't say a self exists except in a momentary way.
Okay, does that remind you of anybody we've talked about?
Not yet.
Heraclitus, does that ring a bell? Heraclitus said you can't step into the same river twice, and so
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah.
everything is always changing. So this is an old idea and very, but I think what we try to do in science, because I've said before that all science assume the truth of Platonism, that somehow there are laws out there that don't change, that are like like the speed of light or the law of gravity. We don't expect them to change tomorrow. Hume says something more radical. He says even that is just based on our prior experience. We can't prove that the law of gravity won't change tomorrow. It's a pretty good chance it won't, but we're basing it on the law of induction, and the law of induction can't be proved except by using the law of induction. Uh, okay, let me move on to so the self and causality are two of the things that Hume denies. And once again, not the common sense way. He's not throwing all of science into the dustbin. He's saying that for metaphysics, you can't trace something that uh, if you can't trace something that you've never observed, uh, no, you can't trace something you've never observed out to a certainty. So he says that you do not, and really this is consistent with Mill's methods or the laws of induction. What you do is you say, does this event always occur with this event? If so, it's caused by it. There are variations to that. If A is never present when B is present, then it's probably not, they're probably not correlated. But if A is always present, and if A isn't present, B never happens, then uh, they are not causally. Did I get that backwards? Anyway, you get what I mean. That's inductive logic, and we use that for everything. All science uses that. But if we try to say, what is the cause? Have you seen the cause itself? When you use the word cause, what you mean is that first event, A. Yeah, it always causes B. What Hume is saying is we don't actually see the link between A and B. We just see that A always occurs in conjunction with B, and if A is absent, then B is absent. Yeah, Meredith.
Well, are you saying then that correlation is the same as causation?
No,
Because that's not right, is it?
no, he's saying he's certainly not saying that. uh, correlation is all we, I think what he would say is correlation is all we have. We don't have causation because causation on a metaphysical level, in other words, this absolute link between this and this, that we don't see with our eyes. We just see the conjunction of these two things. So what we have is correlation, and causation is a term that Aquinas wants to use to prove the existence of God. If the correlation is consistent enough, and we have various ways of sorting this out, as Laurel knows, and I referred to Mill's method. She had a more sophisticated way of doing it, but the idea is how often are these two associated together, and if you get more of one, do you get more of the other? All these methodologies prove that those two things are linked. But what Hume wants to say is we never see the actual link. We just see event A and event B. Um, Listen, I understand a lot of this stuff is puzzling. I'm pretty sure I'm describing Hume correctly, though. And he's very important, and Kant saw the importance of it. Let me move on to the other two things that Hume denies, and those are substance. Substance is something that I don't want to spend too much time on, but it's something from Aristotle, and it just means that behind all the physical things we see, the sensory things see, there is a real essence to what, like if I see um, a Deborah on the screen here, there's a real essence to her that's beyond what I can see. It's the essential Deborah. He wants to say that doesn't exist. There's not an essential anything that's behind. It's what all you can go by is what you can perceive. I don't want to spend too much time on that. Um, so for Hume, we have the self, we have uh, causality, we have substance, and the last one is God. And all those four things he claims we have no sensory evidence of. Uh, and this is very important because I think Kant was the first guy to go, "Oh, that's true. That's clear. That is absolutely true." So those four things, and I also mentioned Hume's fork. Uh, Now, we haven't talked about Hume's ethics yet. And oh, here's one other thing I wanted to mention is this is called Hume's fork, and related concepts are Occam's razor, um, that you don't want to multiply explanations beyond the simplest possible one. Um, in Hume's discussion of miracles, which is a chapter in one of an essay concerning inquiry and concerning human understanding, I think. Um, and this is important too. Hume's razor, you could call it that. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, which by definition breaks the laws of nature and causality, unless the falsehood of that testimony would even be more miraculous. So he's saying, well, is it what's more likely that Lazarus was risen from the dead, or that uh, and that everybody that's ever known anybody that's died is does not rise from the dead? What's more likely? Or that we believe this one guy who said Lazarus rose from the dead? That's not very good evidence. Miracles, well, it's like alien visitations. You never you never have enough information for alien visitation. And what is related to this is some you've heard of these things, what sometimes called Sagan's standard, which is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That comes from Carl Sagan. And then my favorite is Hitchens' razor. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. I love that one. So that's Christopher Hitchens said that. I got to see him talk in Corte Madera, or I guess Larkspur, a few years back. He was not yet dying. Uh, what what a dude. Anyway, that is sometimes called Hitchens' razor, which is what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. I don't know. I just love that. Okay, so his refutation, or his dismissal of miracles, Hume's that is just what I said. In order for a miracle to be believable, the denial of the miracle would have to be even more unbelievable than its truth. I can buy that. Okay. Now, we haven't discussed Hume's ethics yet. Let's see. Oh, Doug, uh, he says, let's see, what does he say? The reports of, excuse me, the reports of, I got to get the chat up. The reports of aliens, this would be something Doug would want to talk about. Um, let's see. Oh, yeah. Recent map showing the places where reports of alien sightings, and they're almost exclusively from North America, as well as some in Central and South America. I don't know. I think there's some miracles reported in Hindu literature. I don't know about that. I'm not sure. You're talking about, oh, you're not talking about miracles. You're talking about alien sightings. Let's see. Uh, right. And Deborah's talking about leap of faith. Yes, we're gonna get to that. The leap of faith. Gerald, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick question. Does Hume ever come up with an example where he thinks that the miracle is more likely than the observation?
No.
For him.
No, he doesn't. But I use this argument all the time about against conspiracy theorists. I remember talking, this guy got really angry too. I was saying, well, one of the conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination was that NORAD was stood down the day Kennedy was assassinated. I don't know if that's true or not, but I thought, am I supposed to believe that all the guys that have, what NORAD is uh, what is it exactly? Anyway, it's our radar defenses of the watching Soviet missiles come supposedly from Alaska. That's our defense of that. And one of the conspiracy ideas was that that was stood down, so something really, really weird is going on that day. And I'm thinking, yeah, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all the officers to do with the military protection of the United States were all in on the Kennedy assassination, and nobody said a word in all the years since. None of those guys who have dedicated their lives at great risk to themselves to defending the United States were all part of a conspiracy to kill Kennedy. That was one of the things. That seems quite a bit more unlikely that some dude did it. Anyway, so I use that argument, and often conspiracy theories are just like that. They say, okay, well, look, did you know this happened? Well, yeah, okay, so that happened on the same day. That doesn't mean that the mafia was involved necessarily. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. You guys probably have your own passionate beliefs about that. What I said to this guy is, look, if in fact he was killed by some great conspiracy, and since that time, not one of the conspirators has offered any evidence to support that, I'm going to say that either it's not true or um, it's way beyond my ability to analyze. If that much power is existing in the hands of that many people without anybody being aware of it, it's way beyond my ability to investigate. Okay, look, this is beside the point here. What I want to do here, let's see, it's already 11. Um, I do want to talk about Hume's ethics. So let me just get started on that, and we'll compete finish with it next time. First of all, uh, Hume is famous for the what's called the is-ought problem, and what what he's going to say, and this is surprising, but I think valid. He's going to say that no amount of facts can tell you what is right or wrong about a situation. Like a thing that we're continually reminded is that there is a huge amount of wealth inequality in the world and in the United States in particular. That's a fact. Now, Hume would say, is it good or bad, though? The facts don't tell you whether it's good or bad. The facts just tell you what is. And so for good or bad, you're going to have to look for some place that's not empirically justifiable with science, which is a shock to a lot of people. A lot of people think, well, it's scientifically true. Like let's say another example. This isn't Hume's. Hume uses trees, for example, I think, which is it's not as emotionally satisfying. But let's say that it can be proven that this is called, by the way, the naturalistic fallacy. If something is naturally occurring, then it's right. So let's say that homosexuality occurs in the natural world, therefore it's natural and we should approve of it. Well, we may emotionally be in sympathy with that point of view, but with Hume's structure, you just say, well, it could still be wrong. Another place I use this is with Augustine. Suppose it could be proven that if everybody was a Christian, let's say we could do some kind of assessment. If everybody's a Christian, people would be happier. And so, therefore, Christianity is good for that reason. And Hume would say, well, Augustine would say, the fact that everybody's happy is pretty good proof that everything is evil. Because people are evil, and if they're all happy, that means the world has gone to hell. That's what Augustine would say. And so uh, Hume just wants to say you can't present facts that immediately apply uh, a moral position. One more story, and then I'll shut up. This really happened many, many years ago, probably 40 years ago. Jesse Jackson was speaking to a businessman's luncheon in New York, and he was introduced by Donald Trump, believe it or not. And Donald Trump introduces him by saying this. He says, Jesse's going to tell you that a very small number of people in the United States have a huge majority of the wealth. What's wrong with that? That was what Trump's introduction. What's wrong with that, I say? And the point is, I don't know. I mean, how are you going to say, well, we don't like it? What else are you going to say? All right, we could go on and on about this, but that's all I'm going to say today. We will discuss, but Hume, just know that Hume is the guy who's responsible for the is ought, the quote is ought problem, and that is that you can't justify any moral position just because of facts. It's also sometimes called a naturalistic fallacy. The opposite of that is a moralistic fallacy, which is that's not right, so it can't be true. Which I'm not that familiar with how the Harvard president got fired. I don't know the details of it, but it seemed like he had done some study that showed that women were not as able to do science. Maybe you guys know this better than I do. Then they weren't as able as men were to do science, something like that. And so he got fired. And same with the bell curve. The bell curve was that black people don't have as high IQ as white people. And so the Hume criticism would be, well, not the Hume criticism, but the moralistic fallacy is it can't be true because it doesn't satisfy my morality. Uh, in other words, it can't be true that black people are inferior on an IQ test to white people because everybody's equal. And that's what I believe. That's called the moralistic fallacy, that reality has to be consistent reality has to be consistent with your morality. And if it isn't, then it must be false. That's called the moralistic fallacy. The other one, that it's real, so it must be good, is called the naturalistic fallacy. Like, I don't know if you guys know about parasitic wasps, but they are among the creepiest things on the planet. And they're real, so I guess they must be good. That's all right. Anybody? Oh, from Douglas to everyone. What are you saying here? Back to the chat here. Larry Summers, a genuine shithead. Maybe so, but is his science wrong? That would be the question to me. Many years ago, I saw a debate on this online. I mean, not online, it wasn't any online, on a TV show. And who was that guy? Pat, Pat Fitz, no, the presidential candidate, real right wing,
Buchanan.
Pat
Buchanan.
Buchanan. Uh, this argument was raised about Bell's curve, and it was some liberals, and he was there too. And I expected him to say, "Well, this guy's right" or something, but no. What he said was actually a great argument. He said, "Look, even if this was true, it makes no difference. People don't achieve because they're smarter than one another. They achieve because of their courage and discipline and perseverance and character. That's why they succeed, not because of some IQ test." I was surprised to hear that come out of the mouth of Pat Buchanan, but it was actually a great defense. It could be. I'm willing to. I don't know what the science was. I'd have to be a scientist. I don't know what the science was on the bell curve. I know that it wasn't approved of because of what's called the moralistic fallacy. It can't be true because we don't like it.
Just don't say bad things about parasitic wasps.
Okay. Man, they are creepy. There's some really, I found out some new really creepy thing the other day that I can't call to mind, but man, the world is full of some creepy stuff. Okay, enough. I've said enough. Anybody else want to chime in and
Thank you, Tony.
complain, refute, insult, any of that stuff? I
Just
see
to,
out. I'm
just
sorry.
to, but just one reflection on the notion that what we do is as we learn progression of thought, we take our knowledge from today and carry it back and reevaluate what we think about Plato. It's interesting that the real breakthrough in artificial intelligence is when they realize that when I go through this process and I learn something, I need to go and look back again, sort of, I need to do the same thing. I need to kind of think, relearn and cast it backwards. So that it goes across the whole spectrum. So it's that teaching ourselves as we know more, we go back and we know it allows us to understand Plato better. Isn't that basically what we're trying to do?
Yeah, I've been following artificial intelligence with interest, not because the main reason is that I think it's very um, uh, interesting in displaying how difficult human consciousness is to replicate. It's much easier with language and like chess. It's famous for beating the greatest chess master. Well, chess is a very confined playing field compared to right now in this room. Just us talking is more complicated than a chess game. Not it's not challenging in that way because no, we're not trying to win here, but the signals that a human being assesses at every instant of his life is so complicated and so layered compared to a game of chess that we tend to overemphasize how smart the computer has to be to win a chess game and forget about my example is always making a sandwich. Let me see a computer make a sandwich. The stuff you have to know to make a sandwich is unbelievable. It's an unbelievable, and I'm not talking about some gourmet sandwich. I'm just talking about a plain old, turkey sandwich. The stuff you have to know to make a sandwich.
Wait. I just have to interject. Bill got up well, at least 5 minutes ago, and proceeded to open the refrigerator. And after pulling out a frozen French roll that he microwaved to warm up, pulled out mayonnaise, mustard, some cold chicken, lettuce, tomato, and a couple of other things. And he's been doing that the entire time while he's been listening, and it looks like an incredible sandwich.
Well, even if it weren't incredible, the fact is that in doing that, he would have recognized if the cheese was moldy, if the turkey had gone rotten. All of those things would be completely automatic to him. But if you could imagine a robot trying to figure out whether the meat had gone bad
Or the bread frozen.
or the bread, we don't have even we're not even at the baby steps in having machines that can do that kind of stuff.
Tony, this reminds me of a comment I heard of several years ago. Someone who was working in the field of AI, he said, "Working on AI has given me great respect for the mental capabilities of an imbecile."
Yes,
And it
absolutely.
was,
And you just keep running into that. I think about it. I just often think about it, like how like yesterday I had a watering can and it was kind of stopped up, and so I had to unscrew the top and kind of get my finger around in the top of it and figure out what was and then get it out. And I thought, could a robot do this? I mean, first of all, would a robot be able to figure out what was going on? Would it be able to unscrew the top? Would it be able to get its finger in there and fish out what was stopping up the it's just a very simple thing that we have a billion years. Let's just say we have only 20 million years behind us, allowing us to do those things automatically. Um,
Yeah,
we're not going to come up with a robot can do it very
20
soon.
even animals have, I mean, the other dog, the Simca, I had a friend who was blind over for lunch on Sunday, and she's very hesitant, not just because of the blindness, but she has some mobility issues. And Simca hadn't seen her before, and he's never been trained to do anything. But when she walked in the door with a cane and walking very, very, very slowly, he walked he came over to her and put his head right under her hand and walked really slowly next to her. And she leaned on him. And he obviously had figured something out in his little dog brain from observation and found a way to make himself useful. And, you know, so I mean, it's, I don't see robots doing, I mean, you have to program a robot to do this. This is a
That's
dog.
right.
He has in his dog brain something that says, this is the way dogs, the way you are in the world.
This is another argument against Hobbes saying that everything we do is selfish, because we can observe that kind of behavior throughout the animal kingdom, that
Yes.
kind of thing where an animal senses another animal being in distress in one way or another and seeks to fix it or at least stand by. And Hobbes saying that that doesn't exist is just so contra, and he considers himself an empiricist, so he knows what, you know, he's observed all this stuff. Well, apparently he hasn't observed all that much. We're going to get back to them because Hume has
induction, but it's induction with a very, very lot of evidence sitting there saying this thing at least has existed in the past. We've observed it.
yeah.
We don't, you know, what the cause is, or God motivating the dog to be a good dog. But I'm not so worried about the cause. I just want to know, how do we act in the world?
Yeah, and so I think those kind of things are observable with people too, despite what Hobbes says.
Mhm.
Hume's by the way, Hume's criticism of Hobbes is this. He says, you know, I mentioned Hobbes was a nominalist in the sense that he says that all of our ideas of good and evil don't exist in the world. They're whatever threatens us, we consider evil, and whatever benefits us, we consider good. That's what Hobbes says. There's no actual goodness or evil. And Hume says, well, if that were the case, we wouldn't understand, if we read history, we wouldn't understand why somebody was acting evil, because it's certainly not going to threaten us. Or you read fiction, you can tell what character is evil and what character is good. It's not going to jump out of the book and hit you over the head. This is Hume's criticism of Hobbes' characterization of good and evil being just down to what threatens us or benefits us. Hobbes is just wrong about that. uh, Anything else? We've gone a little long today, which I never mind. It's always a pleasure. All right. Oh, Doug. Oh, yeah. You're just waving goodbye. Okay. So we'll see you next Thursday, and hopefully Anne and Peter will be back. And also, we'll continue on Hume. The next step will be Kant, Immanuel Kant, and one of the big guys, Hume and Kant, two really, really big guys in the history of Western intellectual development. So we'll be Hume and Kant next week, next time.
Thanks,
Tony.
Tony.
All right, guys.
Thanks, Tony.
Tony.